second scripture today is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 42, verses 1 to 9. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I've taken you by the hand and kept you. I've given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open eyes that are blind, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord. That is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to idols. See, the former things have come to pass. New things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. In the book of Acts, there's a passage where an Ethiopian eunuch is riding in his chariot, and he's reading from one of the spirit songs from Isaiah, a different one one of the servant songs from Isaiah, a different one than the one I've read, but another one of these servant songs that appeared in this part of Isaiah. And Philip, the apostle Philip, comes up to him, and the eunuch says to Philip, I don't understand this. About whom is the prophet Isaiah speaking when he writes these words? And Philip responds, Jesus. These words are about Jesus. I asked the same question during Bible study this past week when we read the passage for today, when we read this servant song. About whom is the prophet Isaiah speaking here? And the answer was clearly Jesus. It certainly fits, doesn't it? As you were listening to that passage, I'm sure that every single one of you had Jesus in mind as I read that description. It fits everything we know about the person and the ministry of Jesus. It fits everything we've read about Jesus. It is the answer that has been given for centuries in the church. Theologians, if you ask theologians, who's Isaiah talking about? They would have said, oh, it's Jesus. If you'd ask your pastors through the years, who is it talking about? They would have likely said Jesus. If you'd asked your Sunday school teachers, they would have said Jesus. If I had asked all of you after I read that passage, who is this about? That would have been the answer you would have all given, right? Right. Here's the tricky part. That passage, before it became a Christian scripture, it was a Jewish scripture. We call it part of the Old Testament, but it's more than just politically correct to use a different term, and instead to refer to that group of passages not as the Old Testament, as if they were only there for us, but to call them the Jewish scriptures, because that is indeed what they are. Now, if we had gone on Friday evening to B'nai B'rith before they had their Sabbath service and asked Rabbi Steve or Cantor Mark, about whom is Isaiah speaking here? If we'd asked any of the congregants at B'nai B'rith, who is Isaiah talking about in this passage? None of them would answer Jesus. Not a single one. Now, there are lots of answers that the folk in the Jewish tradition have for that question, but again, not a single one would have been Jesus. Many would have said, well, it is indeed Isaiah himself. He's talking about himself. That he's looking at his call to ministry and what God has called him to do, and that is what he's talking about. And he's claiming for himself that indeed the Spirit of God, Isaiah is saying, is upon me to do these things. That would be one answer that some folk in the Jewish tradition would give us. Others would have said, well, it's probably about the remnant. Those faithful few folk left. This passage was written or spoken in the time of the exile, and they would have said, it's those folk who in the difficulties of exile are hanging on to their faith, and they're trying to continue to be God's people in the face of all of the difficulties that they're experiencing. And that is who Isaiah is talking about. That is who the Spirit of God is fallen upon. That is who is called to do all of these things. And that's a fairly prominent answer in Jewish circles. Still others would have said, well, maybe Isaiah is talking about the entire nation of Israel. Because Isaiah is envisioning at this point in his ministry a time when the nation will be reformed. When the people will leave exile and go back to their homeland and build a new nation that is the people of Israel, yet again, Israel as a political entity. And he's giving them a picture of what that's supposed to look like, a blueprint for when they get back there, how they're supposed to live together as God's people. And indeed, if they do that, they will be a light for all of the nations. They will be an example of what justice looks like for all people. So many in the Jewish tradition would say, actually, it's referring to this new community yet to be formed as he speaks. And then there are still others that say, yeah, that's true, but, the nation of Israel only lasted for a while. And Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and at that point, our Jewish faith ceased to be one based in a political entity or in a physical space, and instead, we became the people of the diaspora yet again. And our faith changed from being based around the temple to being based around our community together. And so maybe once again, Isaiah is speaking here about the Jewish people spread through all the world and how they are supposed to live as God's people. There's a term, tikkun olam, in Judaism that translates something like remaking the world. And that's a strong tradition. And that could be the kind of thing that Isaiah is speaking about here. There are very, very few people in Judaism who would say this passage is referring to a single Messiah yet to come. Very few. So then the question for us is, what in the world do we do with a passage that's read in an entirely different way than we read it by its original owners? There's a number of things we could do. We could just dismiss their understandings as wrong. They didn't get it. Really wasn't meant for them, it was meant for us. They missed out. That's kind of presumptuous, isn't it? To dismiss that long, deeply held tradition. Plus, it flies in the face of anything that I do as a pastor. The first thing I do every time I open a scripture to build a sermon, the first question I ask is, what did this passage mean in its original context? And if I throw that understanding that the Jewish folk have of this passage out, I've lost the very foundation for anything I have to say. It was, in its original context, a Jewish prophecy. So what do they understand it to mean? It becomes a really, really important question. I could choose instead to just dismiss our traditional Christian understanding as wrong. and say, well, the Jews have been right all this time. It has nothing to do with Jesus. That would be just silly, wouldn't it? You would all go home today asking questions. Did he say what I think he said? Because clearly, everything that we know about Jesus lines up with this text and with the other servant songs. Everything we know about his life and his ministry seems to fit here, and the reality is, as Christians, when we read the Jewish scriptures, we always read them through the lens of Jesus' life and ministry. And indeed, we only understand them through that lens as Christians. So that doesn't feel like a good path to take either. A third choice, and the choice that I think makes the most sense of all, and it makes sense not only for this passage, but for all of those passages in the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. When we read them, we can read them as having multiple fulfillments. Multiple fulfillments. That we can indeed read this and say, yes, Isaiah was referring to himself. And it fits. It fits. His ministry did fit with all of those calls that he was making in this passage. And we can read that and say, yeah, that's exactly what Isaiah was trying to do. We can read the remnant into it, and we can see that it fits them. And that gives us yet a deeper understanding, another deeper understanding of how to see this passage when we think about those folk who were struggling to be Jews in the midst of the exile. We can see the reestablished nation of Israel, and we can read in this that Isaiah was calling them to reject nationalism and all of the sins that had opened the doors to their earlier failures as people. That Isaiah was saying, okay, you're going to get another shot to do it like it's supposed to be done, like God yearns for it to be done. We can read it as referring to the Jewish tradition that goes on even still, with its deep, deep commitment to remaking the world as God yearns for it to be. And of course, as Christians, we look at it and we see Jesus. And we see Jesus as the most complete fulfillment of these scriptures, but not the only fulfillment of these scriptures. Now, when we read passages like this, we need to remember that that need not stop there. Just because the deepest and most complete fulfillment, we believe, happened in Jesus, doesn't render this passage as set in stone as of 33 AD. Instead, it can continue to speak and continue to be fulfilled again and again and again. We can read the Apostle Paul in this passage and see it fulfilled yet again in him as he shapes this theology of a universal, inclusive church wherein there is no Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. That sounds like he's talking about the exact same things to which Isaiah referred. We can see other important leaders of the church through the centuries, none as perfect fulfillments, but all of them pointing us to new understandings of what it means to follow Jesus and be God's people. All of them helping us to read this passage in a deeper way. I have to say, I started to make a list. And I got some great names on there. I put Francis of Assisi was the first one who came to me, who sees all of nature in relationship to God and reminds us that it's not all about us. And my next name was Martin Luther King Jr. We're coming up on his birthday, and how he called us to our deepest values as people of faith, especially but not only around issues of race. And then I started thinking of some names that you might not know. I thought of Menno Simons, the founder of the Mennonite movement. and his understanding that peace and peacemaking are central to what it means to be a Christian. I thought of Roger Williams and soul liberty. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, who started out as a Baptist. But his call to soul liberty pushed him so far, he said, I can't tell people that they need to believe in Jesus because that takes away their soul liberty. And he ended up becoming a Unitarian for that reason. I thought of John Smith, the English Baptist from the 16th century, who ended up living in Denmark because, I think it was Denmark, maybe Holland, somewhere over there. But he had to leave England because of his strong commitment to religious liberty and to separation of church and state, and his call for the English crown to let people practice their faith as they saw fit. I thought of Elias Keach, first pastor of Pennypack Baptist Church in the United States. And important not only because it was one of our earliest churches, but because Elias Keach planted the seeds that became the First Baptist denomination in the United States, as he went up and down the East Coast and reminded the churches that they had to work together in order to accomplish their ministry. Thought of Mother Teresa, who taught us that we can see the face of Jesus not only in the people on the margins, but more clearly on the people who are beyond the margins. The ones whom everyone else writes off. That is where we find the very presence of Jesus. My list was getting really long. And indeed, this could be the longest sermon I've ever preached if I kept on with my list. And it would include lots of names you know. It would include names you don't know. It would include famous people, and it would include Sunday school teachers and pastors and lay folk, many of whom are sitting right here today. And the passage then continues to be filled full again and again and again and again. And it not only points us to those people who are servants of God, about whom the prophet might literally write, "This is my servant," but it also shapes the call for all of us who want to be servants of God. I read a quote this week from Metropolitan Anthony of Soroj. Yeah, what in the world is that? And I had to look it up because I didn't know. That's the title for a Russian Orthodox bishop of a city. They're called Metropolitan. So Anthony was the bishop, a Russian Orthodox bishop of a city. He said this, I love this. We should try to live in a way that if the Gospels were lost, they could be rewritten by looking at us. We should try to live in such a way that if the Gospels were lost, they could be rewritten by looking at us. If Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy, and we lived in such a way that we fulfilled it, people would see Jesus in and through us. Metropolitan Anthony's charge would be filled full through us. Others would learn of Jesus just by looking at the way we live. Justice to the nations. It precludes nationalism. Light to the world, healing to bruised reeds, shelter for dimly burning wicks, the tenacity to make the world a better place. One of the times when I've preached on this passage in the past, I started out with that whole issue of tenacity in this piece in this passage, and I pictured a terrier that we owned for a while, who you could literally give him a rope, and he would grab the rope, and you could spin him around your head, and he would hang on with joy. And that's the kind of tenacity this passage calls us to. It calls for an economic system that gives breathing room to the poor. That's easy to miss in here, but it talks twice. The only thing it mentions twice about prisoners and releasing prisoners. And that sounds, we think people who did bad things. But that's not who was in prison in the ancient world. They didn't put you in prison for stealing something or for hurting someone or for killing someone. That's not what you went to prison for. The only people who were in prison were debtors. And they put you in prison until you paid off the debt. Figure out how that one worked out. And so often someone would go to prison and they would spend the rest of their lives there. Which, if they didn't have folk from the outside bringing them food and things for sustenance, wouldn't have been very long because they didn't provide that for you in prison. So when it says the prisoners are set free, it's talking about canceling debt. It's as Disney says for us, a whole new world. But these are the characteristics that Isaiah was envisioning for himself, for the remnant, for the nation of Israel, for the Jewish people. These are the characteristics and the tasks that we identify in Jesus. And if we look carefully at all of those heroes of faith who have shaped what we believe. And they are the characteristics and tasks to which you and I are called to become contemporary fulfillments of this prophecy. Indeed, if the Ethiopian eunuch was sitting out in the parking lot today as we left church, and one of us went up and said, "Oh, hi," and he said, "Could you tell me who this passage is about?" the best answer we could give would be to take a deep, humble breath, filled with humility and fear, but also with hope and commitment. Say, well, you might not believe this. Isaiah was talking about us. Isaiah was talking about us. Oh yeah, Jesus too. And all those other people. But the hard part is that Jesus is not the only one. Isaiah was talking about us.